Title: A young girl's act of kindness leads to a heartfelt reunion. She was just a 10-year-old with a big dream to buy her long-awaited favorite game, but upon seeing an elderly man in distress, she made an unexpected decision. With her heart full of compassion, she gave up what she wanted most to help him. Little did she know that days later, a mysterious letter would change everything in her life. Lila, a 10-year-old girl, had always been a determined child. After months of saving her small allowance, she finally had enough to buy the game she desired so much. It was a sunny Saturday, and the day couldn't have been more perfect. She woke up early, rushed through breakfast, and ran to the video game store. The game, a new release that all her friends were talking about at school, was all she had been thinking about for the past few weeks. Upon entering the store, her eyes sparkled at the sight of the game cover. There it was, prominently displayed on the shelf as if it were waiting for her. She picked up the box with trembling hands, holding it as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Her heart raced as she approached the checkout. That feeling of accomplishment made her lips curve into an involuntary smile. However, while waiting in line to pay, something outside the store caught her attention. Through the large glass window, Lila saw an elderly gentleman struggling to carry several shopping bags. He walked with difficulty, his shoulders slumped and an expression of fatigue evident on his face. People rushed by, oblivious to his presence, and he looked as if he might give up at any moment. Lila's heart ached at that sight. She looked at the game in her hands and then back at the elderly man. An internal conflict began to arise. She had worked hard, saved every coin for that moment, but at the same time, something inside her screamed that she couldn't just ignore that scene of need. What to do? The line was moving forward, and the decision had to be made quickly. Her time was running out. Lila squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, and before she could change her mind, she put the game back on the shelf. Her feet, which had hurried her into the store, now led her outside toward the struggling man. She ran to him, her breath quickening not only from the run but from the uncertainty of her choice. "Sir, do you need help?" Lila asked, her voice sweet and concerned as she reached the elderly man. The man, surprised by her approach, looked at her with tired but gentle eyes. He seemed astonished that a child had noticed his difficulty while so many adults hurried by. "Oh, my dear, he began to speak, but his voice faltered. There was a mix of surprise and gratitude in his expression as if he were used to being ignored. "I'll help with the bags," Lila said, not waiting for further explanations. She took 2 of the bags he was holding, relieving some of his burden. As they walked together, Lila struck up a conversation to ease the heavy silence. She learned his name was Mr. Edward and that he lived nearby in an old, modest building. "I've lived alone for many years," he remarked with a veiled sadness in his voice. "Age comes, and the body doesn't respond like it used to. The shopping weighs more than it should." Lila, though young, felt the implicit pain in his words. She may not fully understand what it meant to be alone, but she could feel the loneliness in Mr. Edward's eyes. "I live nearby too," Lila said, trying to break the melancholic tone of the conversation. "I like to help when I can. My mom always says that when we do something good, life rewards us in unexpected ways." Mr. Edward smiled. It wasn't a big or animated smile, but a subtle gesture as if Lila's kindness had warmed his heart at least for a moment. "You have a very wise mother, Lila," he said, stopping in front of the gate of an old building. "I don't know how to thank you for this." She had given up something for a stranger. Lila shrugged, trying not to emphasize the fact that she had left her game behind. She knew she had done the right thing. It was nothing. "I can buy the game another day," she said, trying to sound carefree, but deep down, she knew that the game wouldn't be there when she returned. It was the last one on the shelf. Mr. Edward looked at her with a knowing gaze, as if he saw beyond those simple words. He extended his trembling hand and gently touched Lila's shoulder. Sometimes, Lila, small acts of kindness have more impact than you can imagine, and fate, it always finds a way to surprise us. Lila didn't fully understand what he meant, but she felt the weight of his words. With one last smile, Mr. Edward entered his building, and Lila walked home feeling that their meeting was more important than it seemed. As she walked, she passed by the video game store again. Inside, the game was still displayed on the shelf, but now she looked at it differently. She knew she had made the right choice, but a small part of her heart ached at the realization that the game would no longer be hers. When she got home, her mother Clara noticed that Lila was without the game. "Sweetheart, what happened? I thought you were going to buy the game today." Lila gave a small smile and told her the whole story. Her mother listened attentively, a proud expression emerging on her face. "You did the right thing, my dear. Helping others is always more important, and I believe that in some way, the universe rewards kindness." Lila smiled but didn't respond. She didn't know if she believed in the idea that the universe rewards, but in any case, there was something about Mr. Edward that made her feel she needed to help him. That night, as she lay in bed, Lila thought again about the elderly man and his mysterious words, "Fate always finds a way to surprise us." What did he mean by that? Sleep came quickly, but those words echoed in her mind like a riddle waiting to be solved. The next morning arrived with the soft sound of rain tapping on the window. Lila slowly woke up, still thinking about the previous afternoon. She had never seen someone so grateful for something seemingly so simple. As she got ready for school, her thoughts remained focused on Mr. Edward. What would have become of such an elderly man living alone if she hadn't decided to help? Lila's routine that Sunday was almost the same as any other day, however, now there was a slight shadow of doubt in her heart. She knew that making the decision to help Mr. Edward was the right thing to do, but she couldn't shake the little sadness of not having gotten the game she wanted so much. Before leaving the house, Lila talked to her mother while they had breakfast. "You're still thinking about the game, aren't you?" Clara asked, noticing her daughter's distant expression. Lila shook her head, trying to appear indifferent. "A little, I guess, but I don't regret it, Mom. I think I did the right thing by helping Mr. Edward." "You did indeed, and that's what matters," her mother replied with an encouraging smile. "Material things can wait. What you did for Mr. Edward is something no one else would do." Lila gave a small smile, but part of her still wished she had found a way to have both the game and the satisfaction of helping the elderly man. Sunday afternoon passed slowly, and Lila took the opportunity to do her schoolwork. By the end of the afternoon, she felt like taking a walk around the neighborhood. She put on her coat and decided to go to the park a few blocks from her home. The place was peaceful, with wooden benches and a small path cutting through the lawn. She liked to go there when she wanted to think. As she walked slowly, Lila looked toward the video game store. She couldn't resist and went over, even knowing she couldn't buy the game. As she approached the window, she felt a tightness in her chest. The game was no longer there, someone must have bought it, she thought with a twinge of frustration. She sighed and was about to walk away when a familiar voice surprised her. "Lila, is that you?" Lila turned quickly and saw Mr. Edward standing across the street, carrying a few more bags. He smiled when he saw her and began to cross the street carefully. His face seemed brighter than the day before, and his posture, though still hunched with age, had an air of lightness. "Hi, Mr. Edward, how are you?" Lila asked cheerfully. "I'm much better, thanks to you, my young friend," he replied, adjusting one of the bags in his hand. "I was thinking about you today. You did something so beautiful for me, and you gave me a lot to think about." Lila was curious. "Thinking about what?" He smiled gently as if he were about to share an important secret. "About how we sometimes forget the power of small gestures. I've spent so many years alone that I no longer expected anyone to help me. When you appeared, it was as if I hesitated for a moment, choosing his words. It was as if a part of me had been reignited. I didn't want to feel forgotten anymore, and you reminded me that there is still goodness in the world. Lila was touched by Mr. Edward's words. She had never thought that a simple help with shopping could mean so much. I'm glad to have helped, Mr. Edward, but I just did what anyone would do, right? Oh no, my dear, it's not every day that we find someone willing to sacrifice something for another person. You are special, Lila. Never forget that. The elderly man's words echoed deeply within Lila, who for a moment felt her eyes fill with tears. She smiled, trying to hide her emotion. Thank you, Mr. Edward. I think I needed to hear that today. Mr. Edward put his hand in his pocket, and to Lila's surprise, took out an envelope. He extended it toward her. This is for you, Lila. I wanted to thank you somehow, and I believe this might help. Lila looked at the envelope, not understanding. What is this? She asked with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Just read it when you get home, and please accept it. It's my way of returning your kindness. She carefully took the envelope, still confused and not knowing what to think. Mr. Edward waved goodbye, leaving Lila standing there with the mysterious envelope in her hands. What could it be? Money? A thank you note? Or perhaps something more? Lila decided not to open the envelope immediately, she preferred to do it at home, where she could reflect calmly on Mr. Edward's gesture. When she got home, she went up to her room and sat on the bed, looking at the envelope as if waiting for it to reveal itself. She took a deep breath and finally opened it. Inside she found a small letter written in shaky but legible handwriting. Dear Lila, this is a small gesture of gratitude for everything you did for me. I know you gave up something important to help me, and that did not go unnoticed. Buy what you want, but always remember true wealth lies in the heart. With affection, Mr. Edward. Attached to the letter was a note of money, enough for Lila to buy the game she had left behind. Lila read the letter several times, unable to believe what was before her eyes. A part of her was excited to finally be able to buy the game, but another part was touched by Mr. Edward's gesture. That simple help had transformed into something much greater, something she still couldn't fully comprehend. She placed the letter and the money on her nightstand, lying down on her bed with a heart that was both light and confused at the same time. Fate, as Mr. Edward had said, always finds ways to surprise, but what more could come? She didn't know, but she felt that this story was far from over. The next day began like any other, but Lila couldn't stop thinking about the envelope she received from Mr. Edward. Upon waking, the first thing she did was reread the letter he had written. Those touching words were etched in her mind, true wealth is in the heart. While having breakfast, her mother noticed the thoughtful expression on her daughter's face. Are you okay, Lila? You seem to be in another world today, said Clara, trying to grasp what was going on in the girl's mind. Lila looked at her mother and hesitantly told her about the envelope and the letter that Mr. Edward had given her the day before. She showed the letter, and Clara read it attentively, a mixture of surprise and pride spreading across her face. This man was truly touched by what you did, my daughter. It's a beautiful gesture. And what are you going to do with the money? Are you going to buy the game you wanted so much? Lila looked at the money and then at her mother. The decision, which had first seemed simple, was now complicated. She could go to the store and finally buy the game, the object of her desire for so many months, or she could use that money in a different way. What did Mr. Edward mean by true wealth is in the heart? Did he expect her to use the money for something more noble? She didn't know what to do. On one hand, she wanted the game, but on the other, she felt that the money had a greater purpose. Something inside her said that there was still more to come. I don't know, Mom, Lila finally said. I really wanted the game, but now it seems that it's not that important anymore. Something changed after I helped Mr. Edward. Her mother smiled and stroked her hair. That's what we call growing up, my dear. Sometimes our desires change when we realize we can make a difference in someone else's life. Lila didn't respond, but her mother's words echoed in her mind for the rest of the day. At school, while her classmates talked about the new game that had released, she tried to concentrate, but her thoughts were far away, always returning to the letter and Mr. Edward's gesture. The afternoon came, and Lila decided to walk through the neighborhood again. This time she didn't go to the video game store but headed toward Mr. Edward's building. A growing curiosity took over her, and she wanted to thank him in person for the letter and the gift. When she arrived in front of the building, she hesitated. What if he thought she wanted something more? Or worse, what if he wasn't feeling well? As Lila pondered what to do, the building's doorman recognized her. "Oh, you're the girl who helped Mr. Edward, aren't you? He talked a lot about you." Such a noble gesture for such a young girl. Lila smiled shyly. "I wanted to talk to him if he's around," she said, looking at the entrance of the building. The doorman nodded and made a quick call. Moments later, he opened the gate for Lila, indicating that she could go up. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs, feeling a mix of anxiety and nervousness. When she knocked on the apartment door, she heard Mr. Edward's voice on the other side. "Come in, Lila. I was already expecting you." Lila opened the door and found Mr. Edward sitting in his armchair with a cup of tea in his hands. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with books and old photos in wooden frames. There was a sense of nostalgia in the place as if each object told a story. "How did you know I would come?" Lila asked, surprised. Mr. Edward chuckled softly, gesturing for her to sit down. "Oh, my young lady, the heart has its ways of understanding what the mind does not yet know. When you receive a gift, it's natural to want to thank, isn't it?" Lila smiled and nodded, sitting in the chair. "I just wanted to say thank you for the game money, but I also wanted you to know that somehow, I feel I shouldn't spend this money like that." She looked at Mr. Edward, trying to find the right words. "What did you mean by true wealth is in the heart?" Mr. Edward looked at Lila with a deep and wise gaze, as if reflecting on decades of his own life. He placed the cup of tea on the table beside him and sighed lightly before answering. "When I was young, like you, Lila, I also thought that happiness was in the things we possess. But as we grow older, we realize that it is the relationships, the memories, and the acts of kindness that truly give us wealth. You made a gesture of love and compassion, something that no amount of money can buy, and that is what makes life rich." Lila listened attentively, absorbing every word. Something within her stirred, a feeling of understanding that she still couldn't fully express. She realized that perhaps that money wasn't just for her, maybe there was a greater purpose. Before she could respond, Mr. Edward looked at her with a serious expression and said something that made Lila's heart race. "I need your help with something, Lila. Something important, and it's something you can do even at your young age." Lila, sitting in front of Mr. Edward, felt her heart race. His words echoed in her mind. "I need your help with something important." How could a 10-year-old girl help an elderly man with something so serious? She wasn't quite sure what he meant, but there was something in Edward's voice, a mix of urgency and confidence, that made her lean forward, attentive. "How can I help, Mr. Edward?" Lila asked with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The elderly man smiled gently, as if he already knew she would accept his request, but there was a veiled sadness in his eyes, something Lila hadn't noticed until that moment. He slowly got up from the armchair, walking over to a shelf filled with books and small antique objects. Carefully, he took a weathered wooden box and returned to the armchair, placing it on his lap. "Inside this box, Lila, is something very precious to me, but I can no longer take care of it alone," he said in a low voice. "I want you to keep it, but above all, I want you to understand the value of what is here." Lila looked at the small wooden box with growing curiosity. It wasn't particularly large, but it seemed old, full of stories. What could be so important that Mr. Edward would trust it to a 10-year-old girl? "What's inside?" Lila asked hesitantly. Mr. Edward opened the box slowly, revealing a time-yellowed envelope and next to it, a small silver locket with an inscription engraved on it. Lila gazed at the object, feeling a chill run down her spine. There was something special about that locket, something she couldn't explain. "This locket belonged to my wife," Mr. Edward explained with a tender expression in his eyes. "It was the first gift I gave her when we were young. She wore it every day until the end of her life. Now, I want it to continue being cared for by someone who understands what it means. Someone like you, Lila." Lila was silent, absorbing the weight of Mr. Edward's words. She had never seen something so precious, and the idea of taking care of such an important object filled her with responsibility. But there was more. The envelope looked equally important, and Lila's curiosity grew with each passing second. "And the envelope?" she asked, pointing to the old paper. "Inside that envelope, there is a letter," Mr. Edward said, his voice a bit more tremulous now. "A letter I wrote many years ago but never had the courage to send. It's for someone I haven't seen in a long time, and now, Lila, I need you to deliver it." Lila was paralyzed for a moment. Deliver a letter? That didn't seem like such a complicated task, but by the look on Edward's face, she knew it was not a common assignment. Who could that person be? Why had he never sent the letter, she wondered. Who is that person? Lila asked, her curiosity now at its peak. Mr. Edward sighed deeply, as if preparing to share a story he had kept for many years. He looked at Lila with an expression that mixed sadness and hope. "The person to whom this letter is addressed is my son," he confessed, his voice filled with emotion. "We grew distant many years ago, and I never had the courage to make amends. He moved far away, went on with his life, and we lost touch. I always wanted to fix things, but time passed, and I became afraid it was too late." Lila felt a wave of empathy for Mr. Edward. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose contact with someone so close, especially a son. That was a burden Edward carried with him, and now, somehow, she had been chosen to help lighten that load. "I will deliver the letter, Mr. Edward," Lila said determinedly. "But where is he? How can I find him?" Mr. Edward took a blank sheet of paper, and with a trembling hand, wrote down an address and his son's name, David. He handed the paper to Lila along with the envelope. "He lives in the next town over, not too far, but I no longer have the strength to make the trip. Please, Lila, deliver this letter for me. Tell him I'm sorry, that I'm sorry for everything." Lila felt a lump in her throat. That was a request filled with pain but also with hope. She knew she couldn't fail. Holding the envelope and the paper with the address, she looked at Mr. Edward with determination. "I promise I will deliver the letter. Your son will receive this, and everything will be okay." Mr. Edward smiled, and although his smile was gentle, there was immense gratitude in his gaze. He knew he was entrusting something very important to that girl, but he also knew that Lila was special. She had a pure heart, and that was what he valued the most. As Lila left the apartment, feeling the weight of responsibility in her hands, she knew her life had taken an unexpected turn. What started as a simple act of kindness now enveloped her in a mission that could change an entire family's life. The rain began to fall again as she descended the building stairs, but Lila knew she couldn't wait too long. That letter needed to be delivered, and she would do everything to fulfill the promise she had made to Mr. Edward. The question lingering in the air was how would his son react to receiving a letter of reconciliation after so many years apart. The next day, Lila woke up with a mix of nervousness and excitement. The mission of delivering the letter to Mr. Edward's son felt both grand and frightening. She looked at the envelope on her bedside table, as if it were the beginning of a great journey. The responsibility weighed on her, but there was also a desire to see how this story would unfold. As she went down for breakfast, Lila told her mother about Mr. Edward's request. "He asked me to deliver this letter to his son," Lila explained, showing the envelope to her mother. "They had a falling out a long time ago, and Mr. Edward thinks he can't make this trip alone." Clara listened to the story attentively, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding. She knew how much Edward meant to her daughter and how important that gesture was. "That's very noble, Lila, but how are you going to get there? It's not a short trip, and you're still a child. Maybe it's better if we talk to him about how to do this together." Lila knew her mother was right. Traveling alone to an unfamiliar city was not something she could do without help. But at the same time, there was something inside her that made her feel it was her personal duty to fulfill this mission. "Maybe Mr. Edward can give us more instructions, or I could go with him," Lila suggested, not hiding her determination. Clara pondered for a few moments, and realizing the importance of that moment for her daughter, made a decision. "All right, I can accompany you there. Let's deliver this letter together. That way, you can keep your promise without putting yourself at risk. What do you think?" Lila smiled, feeling an immense relief. The idea of having her mother by her side made her feel more confident. They could then deliver the letter together, and who knows, help Mr. Edward restore his relationship with his son. That same afternoon, Lila and her mother decided to visit Mr. Edward again to inform him about the travel plan. Upon arriving at the building, they were greeted by the doorman, who guided them to his apartment. Lila felt a slight nervousness, imagining how Edward would react to their idea of accompanying the letter delivery. Mr. Edward welcomed them with a warm smile, visibly relieved to see Lila again. Clara greeted the elderly man, and soon they began to discuss the plan to deliver the letter. "I really appreciate you wanting to help," Edward said, his voice laden with emotion. "But I need to be honest, I'm not sure how David, my son, will react to receiving this letter after so many years. He may be resentful, or perhaps he has already forgotten me." Lila, sitting beside her mother, couldn't help but feel a pang in her heart upon hearing those words. Mr. Edward's fear was palpable. After all, time often places barriers between people, and he feared that the emotional distance was irreparable. "But I believe he will understand, Mr. Edward," Lila said, trying to convey hope. "He is your son. Even with everything that happened, I'm sure he still cares about you." The elderly man smiled, touched by Lila's faith in her mission. There was something pure about that young girl, something that made him believe that perhaps fate was indeed conspiring for a reconciliation. "I don't know how to thank you both for this," Mr. Edward said, looking from Lila to her mother. "I wish I had done this a long time ago, but fear held me back. You are giving me a second chance to correct what I did wrong. The important thing is that you are trying now," Clara replied with a gentle smile. "Sometimes regret is a sign that there is still time to fix things." The following morning, with everything planned, Lila and her mother boarded the bus heading to the city where David lived. The journey would take a few hours, and Lila spent much of the trip watching the scenery pass by the window while holding the envelope in her hands. The letter seemed to carry even greater weight now that the trip was underway. "Mom, what do you think will happen when we get there?" Lila asked, turning to Clara. "I don't know, dear, but the important thing is that we are doing our part. The rest depends on David. We can only hope that he is open to hearing what his father has to say." The bus continued on its way, and Lila couldn't stop imagining what it would be like to meet David. Would he remember his father fondly, or had the distance created an insurmountable wall? Upon arriving in the city, mother and daughter followed Edward's instructions and headed to the indicated address. It was a simple house with a small garden in front. Lila's nervousness increased with each step she took toward the door. She stopped in front of the entrance, took a deep breath, and looked at her mother, who encouraged her with a nod. It was time to fulfill the promise she made to Mr. Edward. Lila knocked on the door, the sound echoed inside the house, and the seconds that followed felt eternal. Finally, the door opened, revealing a tall man with a serious demeanor. He had features similar to Edward but with something harder in his expression, as if the years of distance had left deep marks. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice deep and restrained. Lila swallowed hard before replying. "Are you David?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. The man furrowed his brow, clearly confused by the presence of a girl and her mother at his door. "Yes, it's me. Who are you?" Lila held the envelope tightly, feeling the weight of everything it represented. She looked at the man in front of her and with a mixture of courage and emotion, extended the letter. "I am Lila, and your father, Mr. Edward, asked me to deliver this letter to you." David's eyes widened for a moment. He looked at the envelope as if it were something he never expected to see. The name Edward seemed to awaken a series of emotions he had tried to suppress for years. He took the letter with trembling hands, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Lila knew that from that moment on, something much bigger was at stake. The reunion between father and son depended on how David would react to those words written years ago. David took a deep breath, holding the letter. But before he could open it, he stared intently at Lila and her mother. "Did you come from far away for this?" he asked, still processing everything that was happening. Silence hung in the air as David carefully opened the envelope. Lila and her mother watched with a mix of anxiety and hope. David seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if pondering whether or not to continue. When he finally pulled the letter out, his hands were visibly trembling. He looked at the paper for what felt like an eternity but didn't begin reading immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, as if he were emotionally preparing to face something he had avoided for years. The words written by Mr. Edward were before him, but the weight of the emotions that came with those lines seemed to prevent David from moving forward. He looked at Lila and Clara, his expression one of confusion, pain, and a mix of feelings that he clearly wasn't ready to confront. Leave your comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. David then asked, trying to break the silence that had settled. His voice sounded firm but with a vulnerability behind it. "Do you know my father well?" Lila exchanged a quick glance with her mother before responding. "Yes, I met him not long ago, but he talked a lot about you. I helped him the other day, and since then, he has told me about you. He misses you very much, and I think this letter is his way of trying." Lila hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Trying to fix what happened." David pressed his lips together as if he were struggling not to let on what he was feeling. He looked at the letter again but still seemed reluctant to read it. "Do you think it's that simple?" he said, his voice growing heavier. "After everything that happened, he sends me a letter. Just a letter." David's tone was bitter, and Lila could feel the resentment bubbling to the surface. The anger and pain he had bottled up for years were finally emerging. "I don't know what happened between you, David," Clara said gently, intervening. "But what I do know is that it's never too late to try. Your father is suffering, and he seemed very regretful to me. Maybe this letter won't change the past, but it could be the beginning of a reconciliation." David looked at her, visibly touched by the words but still in internal conflict. It was as if he was waging a battle within himself. On one hand, he wanted to reject that attempt at reconciliation, but on the other, something inside him urged him to give it a chance. Finally, he sighed heavily and began to read the letter in silence. David's eyes scanned the words written by his father, and Lila could see the subtle change in his expression as he progressed through the letter. The initial rigidity gave way to a deeper look of pain and regret, as if he were recalling the past while reading. "Dear son, there are many things I would like to say to you, but I don't know if there are enough words to express how sorry I am for what happened between us. Time has passed, and I've become afraid that it might be too late to fix what I destroyed. But today, seeing the life I lead, I realized that the worst mistake I made was letting pride keep me away from you." David paused, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the emotions that surged within him. Lila and her mother remained silent, respecting his space to process the content of the letter. "I know I can't change what I did, but I hope these words find a place in your heart because, in mine, son, you have always been present, even in the moments when everything seemed lost. I only ask for a chance to see you again, to talk, to try to start over. I know I have made many mistakes, but I also know that a father's love doesn't disappear, and mine for you has never disappeared." Those final words seemed to hit David like a wave. He lowered the letter, his eyes misty, and looked at Lila and Clara with a weary expression. "Does he think a letter can fix everything?" David asked, his voice broken by the weight of pain. "Years of silence, years when he wasn't there when I needed him most. Now he writes to me asking for forgiveness." Lila, with the purity of someone who sees things more simply, replied softly, "Maybe he doesn't know how to fix the past, but he is trying now, David. He is alone, and the only thing he wants is a chance. You have every right to be hurt, but maybe giving this chance isn't just for him but also for you." David looked at her, surprised by the depth of the words coming from someone so young. He knew Lila was right. Part of his pain came from the fact that he also wanted reconciliation but didn't know how to admit it. Pride, resentment, all those feelings had kept him away, but now, in front of that letter, he found himself confronted with the opportunity to heal his wounds. "You are right, Lila," he said, his voice hoarse. "Maybe this is the only chance I have to resolve this, but I don't know if I'm ready." Silence filled the room once again as David contemplated what to do. He stood up, walking to the window and looking outside as if seeking answers on the horizon. Lila and her mother waited patiently, knowing that this moment was crucial. "I need to think," David said, turning to them. "I need time to process all of this." "We understand," Clara replied with a compassionate tone. "We're not here to pressure you, just to fulfill a request." Lila stood up, feeling that she had done her part. She looked at David with a gentle gaze, knowing that the future of that relationship was now in his hands. "I hope you give him a chance, David," Lila said. "I think he really needs you." David nodded but said nothing. He accompanied them to the door and waved goodbye. Lila and her mother left the house, leaving David alone with his thoughts and the letter in his hands. Outside, as they walked back to the bus station, Lila looked at her mother and asked, "Do you think he will forgive Mr. Edward?" Clara smiled and replied, "I think so, Lila, but now it depends on him. We did our part, and I believe that deep down, David knows what he needs to do." As the bus took them back home, Lila felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The letter had been delivered, but what would happen next? Would David find the strength to forgive his father, and what would their reunion be like? These questions lingered in Lila's mind as she watched the landscape change outside the window. When they arrived home, already getting dark, Lila went straight to her room. She lay down on the bed, exhausted, not physically but emotionally. The trip, David's harsh words, Mr. Edward's evident pain, everything seemed to have accumulated in her thoughts. She looked at the ceiling, the words from the letter still echoing in her mind. A father's love never disappears. The next morning, Lila woke up feeling restless. Part of her wanted to visit Mr. Edward immediately and tell him about the delivery of the letter, but she knew she couldn't rush the process. She knew David would need time to deal with his emotions. Even so, her concern for the elderly man was constant. During breakfast, Clara noticed her daughter's distant look. "Still thinking about Mr. Edward?" her mother asked, placing a plate on the table. "Yes, Mom. I'm worried. What if David doesn't forgive him? What if he doesn't even respond to the letter? Mr. Edward has no one, he put all his hopes in this reconciliation." Clara, who knew how much Lila cared about Edward, smiled softly. Forgiveness is something that takes time, Lila. We can't force David to forgive his father, but we did what we could. Now it's up to him. Lila nodded, but that didn't completely calm her. After a few minutes of silence, she made a decision. I think I'm going to visit Mr. Edward today. I want to know how he is, and who knows, maybe David has responded to the letter. Her mother agreed, understanding her daughter's anxiety to see how this story would unfold. Lila left home shortly after lunch and headed to the building where Edward lived. The path, which once seemed light and full of hope, was now marked by a mix of expectation and fear. What if Mr. Edward was worse? What if he had completely lost hope? Upon arriving at the building, the doorman, who already knew her, greeted her with a warm smile. You're going to see Mr. Edward again, aren't you? He asked. Yes, is he home? Yes, he is. He seemed to be waiting for someone today. I think he will be happy to see you. These words comforted Lila, who quickly climbed the stairs and knocked on Edward's apartment door. After a few seconds, the door opened slowly, revealing Mr. Edward, who looked more fragile than usual but smiled upon seeing her. Oh, Lila, I'm so glad you came, he said in a low but welcoming voice. Please come in. Lila entered, noticing that the atmosphere seemed quieter than usual, as if loneliness had become even more present since the last time she was there. She sat on the sofa while Edward settled into his usual armchair. I came to talk about the letter, Lila began, feeling nervousness tighten her chest. I delivered it to David. He read it, but he needs time to think. He was very emotional, but I think it was hard for him. Mr. Edward sighed, as if he had been expecting this response, but his gaze still carried a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Lila, for doing this for me. I know David must be dealing with a lot. It's been so long. His voice trembled slightly, but he composed himself. But just the fact that he read the letter gives me a little peace. Lila watched Edward, trying to gauge his emotions. She knew he wanted more than just a reading of the letter, he wanted the reunion, the forgiveness, but she also knew that time, as her mother had said, was the only remedy for deep wounds. Did he say anything about what he thought of the letter? Edward asked, a bit hesitantly, as if fearing the answer. Lila reflected for a moment. He said it was hard, that he didn't know if he was ready, but I think, deep down, he wants to see you. He's just scared, like you have been for so long. Mr. Edward looked at Lila, and for a brief moment, tears welled up in his eyes, but he quickly brushed them away. Fear, he murmured. Fear is something that destroys so many good things, but love is always stronger. I know that, in the end, he will understand this. Silence settled between the two for a few moments until Edward leaned slightly forward and looked at Lila with a more determined gaze. Lila, you did something incredible for me, something that no one else would have done. I know that with time, David will come looking for me, and when that day comes, I want you to be here too. I want you to see the result of what you started. Lila smiled, touched by Edward's request. I will be here, Mr. Edward. I promise. Days passed slowly, and Lila continued her frequent visits to Mr. Edward. Although David had not yet reached out, she and the elderly man kept hope alive. They talked about life, about Edward's past, and little by little, Lila got to know more about the life of the man who was once just a stranger in her neighborhood. One afternoon, when Lila was about to leave school, her phone rang. It was a message from David. Her heart raced at the sight of his name on the screen. The message was simple but filled with emotion. Lila, I'm ready. I want to see my dad. Can you meet me at his house tomorrow? Lila felt an immediate relief as if a great cloud had been lifted. David had finally made his decision, and now the long-awaited reunion was about to happen. The next day, Lila went to Edward's apartment with the news. The elderly man, upon hearing that David would come, looked visibly emotional but also nervous. The reunion he had dreamed of for so long was about to take place. What would he say to his son? How would he explain himself after so many years of silence? The day of the reunion had finally arrived. Lila could hardly contain her anxiety as she walked to Mr. Edwards' apartment. She had promised David she would be there, and more than anything, she wanted to ensure everything went well. She knew how delicate this moment was for both of them. Upon arriving at the building, her heart was racing. The doorman, who knew her well, waved at her, allowing her to go up without questions. As she reached the apartment door, Lila took a deep breath before knocking. The soft sound echoed down the silent hallway, and seconds later, the door slowly opened. Mr. Edward was there, with a look of nervousness and hope. He wore a clean dress shirt, as if he wanted to look his best for his son, but his eyes, though hopeful, were filled with uncertainty. "Lila, you came," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "I'm so nervous. I don't know what to say when he arrives." Lila smiled, trying to convey confidence. "Everything will be fine, Mr. Edward. Just be honest with him. I think that's the most important thing." The elderly man nodded, still looking worried but visibly grateful for Lila's presence there. They entered and sat in the small living room. Time seemed to pass slowly, and each second approaching David's arrival increased the tension in the air. The room was tidy, with simple but well-kept furniture. Old photos of Edward and his wife were framed on the walls, filling the space with nostalgia. Lila looked at the photos, imagining how things might have been before the separation between father and son. "You know, Lila, when David was little, he loved coming here and playing with those books you see on the shelf," Edward said, pointing to a bookcase full of old volumes. "He liked to make up stories and pretend he was the hero of them." Lila smiled, envisioning David as a happy child, free from the burdens that the distance had placed in his life. "I think you both will be able to create new memories, Mr. Edward," Lila replied. "There is still time for reconciliations." Lila's words seemed to bring a bit of peace to the elderly man, but before he could respond, they heard knocking at the door. The silence in the room was immediate. Edward stood still for a moment, as if preparing for the impact of that moment. "It's him," Edward whispered, his voice full of emotion. Lila got up and went to the door. When she opened it, David was standing there, visibly tense. He wore simple clothes, but his expression carried a mix of uncertainty and determination. His gaze was heavy, as if he were about to face something he had been postponing for a long time. "Lila," David began, his voice hesitant, "I'm here, and I think I'm ready for this." Lila gave a small, encouraging smile and stepped aside, opening the door wider for him to enter. David stepped inside, his eyes immediately meeting his father's. Time seemed to stop. Mr. Edward, who had stood up slowly, looked at his son with tear-filled eyes. It was as if all the years of silence and distance materialized in that moment, and both felt the weight of everything they had lost. "David," Edward said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't know what to say." David was silent for a few seconds, clearly struggling to find the right words. He looked at his father, and for the first time in a long time, his eyes softened. "I don't know what to say either, Dad. I just know that." He paused, his voice trembling. "I think I also made mistakes in not trying before." Edward stepped forward, his trembling hand reaching out as a gesture of approach. "David, son, The words caught in his throat, and he simply opened his arms in a silent gesture of reconciliation. For a moment, it seemed as if time froze again. David looked at his father, his face marked by the pain of the past, but then, slowly, took a step forward and accepted Edward's embrace. They held each other for a long moment, saying nothing, just feeling each other's presence, letting the barriers of pride and resentment dissolve. I'm so sorry for everything, Dad, David murmured, his voice muffled in his father's shoulder. I am too, my son. I am too, Edward replied, his voice breaking but full of relief. The reunion they both feared had finally happened, and Lila's presence there was a reminder that sometimes a simple act of kindness can bring back what seemed lost. After the hug, father and son sat at the table, still a bit bewildered, but now there was an atmosphere of hope in the air. The silence was broken by small exchanges of words about the past, about the time that had passed, and the wounds that both carried. Lila stepped back a little, giving space to the two. She knew that moment was theirs, but the joy of seeing the beginning of a reconciliation made her heart swell with happiness. Dad, I didn't imagine you still thought of me, David said, his voice still heavy with emotion. I thought you had forgotten me. Edward shook his head, his eyes filled with tenderness. How could I forget you, David? You are my son. You have always been with me, even when pride prevented me from reaching out to you. But I never stopped thinking about you, and I regret so much the time we lost. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I regret it too, Dad. I think we both let pride keep us apart for too long. But I'm here now, and I want to try to start over. Mr. Edward nodded, with tears in his eyes. Let's start over, son. I don't want to waste any more time. Lila smiled, feeling that her role in that story had concluded beautifully. She knew that the reunion did not erase the years of separation, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance for healing and renewal. When they finally reached the end of that afternoon of reconciliation, David promised to visit his father more often. They said goodbye with the promise to start fresh, leaving the past behind and focusing on creating new memories. As Lila was preparing to leave, David called her. Lila, you were the key to all of this. Thank you. I can't express how grateful I am. Lila smiled and replied simply, I just did what I felt was right. David nodded, still looking at that girl with admiration, who with her kindness had restored something so valuable. Edward, in turn, looked at Lila with eyes full of gratitude. Lila, you brought my son back. I can never thank you enough. With a light heart and full of joy, Lila left the apartment, knowing that Mr. Edward and David now had the chance to heal the past and build a future together. She walked home feeling at peace, knowing she had made a difference in someone's life. The days that followed David and Mr. Edward's reunion were filled with a quiet calm and hope. Lila continued her school routine, but she always wondered how things were going between father and son. She didn't visit them immediately, wanting to give them the space they needed to start their lives anew, but a part of her longed to know how they were adapting to the new reality. One day, while Lila was returning from school, a message from David appeared on her phone. The message was simple but filled with gratitude. Thank you, Lila. We are building something new. Come visit us whenever you want. Upon reading those words, Lila's heart warmed, knowing that her gesture had been the starting point for the reconstruction of a relationship that seemed lost. This made her happy. She decided to accept the invitation, and 2 days later, she prepared to visit Mr. Edward and David again. It was a sunny afternoon, with a light breeze swaying the trees as Lila walked toward Edward's building. She didn't know exactly what to expect from this visit, but she was curious to see how father and son were handling this new phase. Upon arriving, the doorman, now accustomed to her frequent visits, smiled and let her in without ceremony. Lila went up to the apartment, and when she knocked on the door, she heard laughter from inside. It was a comforting sound, a sign that things were changing for the better. The door opened, revealing David with a genuine smile on his face. He looked different from the first time she met him. Lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Lila, I'm so glad you came. Come in, please, he said enthusiastically. As she entered, Lila noticed a completely different atmosphere. The environment that had once seemed filled with sadness and regret now felt more vibrant, full of life. Mr. Edward, sitting in his armchair, looked healthier, with a light in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Lila," exclaimed Edward, breaking into a wide smile upon seeing her. "We were just talking about you. David and I were reminiscing about how all of this began." "That's true," David laughed, pulling a chair for Lila. "If it weren't for her, we wouldn't be here together now." Lila sat down, observing the connection between them. The atmosphere was light, and the conversations flowed naturally. The tension of the past seemed to have dissolved. Father and son had found a way to reconnect, and Lila felt honored to have been the bridge that brought them together. "So, how have things been?" Lila asked, looking at both of them. David laughed, glancing at his father before answering. "We're getting along. We still have a lot to catch up on, of course. Years of distance don't heal overnight, but we're trying hard, and I think we're doing well, right, Dad?" Edward nodded, smiling. "Yes, David and I have talked about everything, things I never had the courage to say before. It feels like all the silence between us has broken now. We're trying to make up for lost time." Lila felt a wave of joy upon hearing that. She knew that the reunion had been an important step, but seeing the continuity of that process was even more rewarding. As they talked, David shared about the moments they had spent together in the last few days. He had started visiting his father regularly, and Edward had even begun to go out for small walks again. It was as if Edward's life had gained a new purpose, and David also seemed to be rediscovering the importance of family. In the midst of the conversation, Mr. Edward looked at Lila with a serious but affectionate gaze. "Lila, you changed my life and David's. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't helped me that day with the bags." Edward paused for a moment, as if processing the impact of it all. "I think fate has curious ways of putting us on the right path, and your kind gesture was the key to opening that door." Lila, moved by Edward's words, smiled shyly. "I just did what I thought was right, but seeing you both together now makes me feel like it was all worth it." "It meant more than you can imagine," said David, leaning forward in his chair. "I was stuck in a cycle of resentment, and deep down, I knew I wanted to forgive my father. But without that little push you gave us, Lila, I wouldn't have had the courage to face it." The silence in the room was filled with a sense of mutual gratitude. What had started as a small gesture from Lila had now transformed into something much greater, the healing of a relationship that seemed broken forever. After spending some more time talking, Lila stood up to leave. She was happy to see that David and Edward were doing well, but she felt it was time to let them follow this new path on their own. As she said her goodbyes, David accompanied her to the door. He seemed to want to say something important but hesitated for a moment. "Lila, before you go," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I wanted to give you something that means a lot to me and that I believe now belongs to you." Lila, curious, looked at him as David took a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth out of his pocket. When he opened it, it revealed the silver locket that Mr. Edward had given to Lila some time ago, the gift from his late wife. I don't know if I should accept this, David," Lila said, surprised. "You should," David replied with a smile. "This locket has a very significant meaning for our family, and it was you who helped us reclaim it. I think fate wanted it to be with you." Lila, touched, took the locket in her hands. She knew the sentimental value that object carried, and accepting it felt like a gesture of recognition for the role she played in their lives. "Thank you, really," Lila said, holding the locket against her chest. "I will take care of it with great affection." David nodded, and with one last smile, Lila said goodbye and went down the building stairs. As she walked back home, she felt fulfilled. She knew she had made a difference in Edward and David's lives, but she also understood that this act of kindness had changed something within herself. Now, with the locket in her hands, Lila reflected on everything that had happened. Had fate really planned that meeting for her to be the link between father and son? And what else might life have in store for her, someone who believed in the power of small gestures? A few weeks passed since the reunion between David and Mr. Edward, and Lila's life returned to normal. She attended school, helped her mother at home, and occasionally visited Mr. Edward to see how he and his son were doing. Every time she went there, she noticed that the connection between the two was stronger, and that filled her with joy. Mr. Edward had regained some of the energy that seemed lost, and David visited him frequently, rebuilding the relationship they had lost over the years. One afternoon, while Lila was doing her schoolwork, her mother entered the room with a smile on her face. "Lila, there's someone here to see you." Lila furrowed her brow, curious about who it could be. When she went down the stairs, she found Mr. Edward and David at the door with warm smiles. "Can we come in?" David asked playfully. "Of course, come in," Lila replied, surprised by the visit. The two entered, and Clara offered them coffee while everyone settled into the living room. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and friendly conversations, but Lila could sense that there was something more behind that visit. After a while, Mr. Edward looked at Lila with a more serious expression, yet still filled with affection. "Lila, we came here today because we wanted to tell you something important," he began, holding a small box in his hands. "David and I have talked a lot in the past few weeks, and we came to a decision about something special." Lila looked at the box, intrigued. It wasn't very big, but it seemed to carry some emotional weight. Mr. Edward opened it slowly, revealing a leather-bound notebook, a bit worn with time but visibly well cared for. "What is this?" Lila asked, curious. "This is my wife's diary, David's mother," Edward said with a nostalgic smile. "She used to write about the simplest things in life but also about the importance of kindness and love. And this is what we want to give you today, Lila. We want you to have this diary as a symbol of what you taught us." Lila looked at the diary with shining eyes. She knew how important that object must be to them, but she couldn't understand why they wanted to give it to her. I don't know if I can accept this," Lila said, her voice trembling. "This diary is a part of your family." David smiled and placed a hand on Lila's shoulder. "You are part of this family now, Lila, and in a way, all of this happened because you taught us something. My mother always valued kindness, it is only fair that you have this." Lila felt tears starting to well up in her eyes. It was a valuable gift, full of meaning. She carefully took the diary, feeling the emotional weight in her hands. "I promise I will take care of it with all my heart," she said, moved. They spent the afternoon reminiscing, with David and Edward sharing more memories of when the family was still united and how Lila's gesture had brought new life to both of them. The atmosphere in the room was filled with pure gratitude and affection, and Lila felt that her role in this story was truly complete. In the late afternoon, David and Edward said their goodbyes, leaving Lila with the diary in her hands and a sense of fulfillment in her heart. Her mother, watching from afar, was visibly proud of her daughter. "I always knew you had a special heart, Lila," said Clara as she tidied up the room. "But what you did for this family was beyond anything I could have imagined." Lila smiled, holding the diary close to her chest. "I guess sometimes we don't realize the impact we can have on people's lives. It all started with a simple choice, Mom. I just wanted to help." Clara nodded, moved by her daughter's words. "And that's exactly what made all the difference.